So thank you again for joining us today. It is always a delight to be here with you. For those who have not had the good fortune to meet, I'm Brad Love. I'm one of the GRIT co-founders as well as a health outcomes researcher. And I am really delighted to be with you today to talk about designing with the patient in mind, amplifying the patient voice in medicine's development and approval. I would also like to kick off today's session to just note that it is Lupus Awareness Month. And just the other day was World Lupus Day on the 10th. In the spirit of today's session, focusing on keeping people and their individual needs at the center of treatments, we also want to share a resource from the Lupus Foundation of America, compliments of one of our friends in the Advocacy Exchange who recommended this to us. The Lupus Foundation has recently launched Strategies to Embrace Living with Lupus Fearlessly, also known as the SELF tool. It's an online self-management program designed to help people with lupus live their best lives that allows space for continued education, tracking symptoms. But one of the reasons we want to bring it up is it's a powerful example for the kind of access-centered resource and patient-centered resource that might be valuable in the space in which you're an advocate. And if you're here, whether it's your first session or 30th, or whether it's your first day in advocacy or your third decade, you are an advocate. And so this is the kind of thing that can help us share resources and might be valuable as a model in your domain. So we wanted to share it with you today. There is more information in the chat at a link that you can go to see the tool. As well, they have some wonderful YouTube videos demonstrating it. But this is part of the resource sharing that we do together as a community. And so I really appreciate people bringing that up. Similarly, while your attention is directed to the chat, if you haven't had the chance yet to share where you're joining us from today, we would love to see that, because that's also a really powerful part of our experience, to know that this truly is global. And so if you've not had that occasion, we'd love to hear about where you're coming to us from. And we can take a minute as I do that myself. All right. Oh, Bozeman, Montana. Okay. Miami Beach, Southern California. All right. Canada. Love it. Okay. Neil's covering the globe today between Berlin and Delhi, New York. Okay. One from London. Fantastic. I appreciate all that. The geography is additionally relevant, as you will see in the conversation with our panelists today, because the way that regulatory approvals happen is very different in different geographies. And that's one of the things we want to bear in mind, particularly with today's session, where we think about the way that the process exists across Europe, broadly speaking. Those are elements of a regulatory process that are being considered as a model for much of the rest of the world. And so for you as an advocate to be aware of these different processes, it might help open some spaces after today's conversation where you can think about the way that policy is shaped in your country or your geographic region and how you can be influential. And so with this goal today to think about how new treatments develop, there's space for us to share experiences, much as we did with the SELF tool earlier. So that said, to think about these geographies and experiences, I'll ask each panelist to please take about 3 minutes to introduce themselves, including a little bit about background and why the development of treatments, and specifically the regulatory environments, is of particular importance to you. If we could we start please with you, Katie, to hear a little bit about your work at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research?
So I'm Katie Coco. I currently lead the Fox Foundation's clinical research team, which is focused on the intersection of research participation, drug development, and commercial product launch. I've been at the organization about 9 years, and what has been really exciting to see in the Parkinson's field is the evolution of investment from researchers, investments from companies that are looking to develop new treatments for Parkinson's disease. When the organization started about 20 years ago, that was not the case. And I think what is important for us as an organization, and why I'm so excited about today's panel, is that we sit at the nexus of research and the patient community. We're the world's largest nonprofit funder of Parkinson's research. But of course, within our foundation's name, we have a patient who started the organization. And we all the research that we aim to fund is meant to do so through the lens of people living with Parkinson's disease. And so I'm excited to share some examples of how we have evolved our approach to engaging patients within our organization, how we've seen patient partnerships and patient scientists work well alongside traditional scientists that might have some additional initials after their name. And start by saying thank you to everyone who is an advocate, because your voice is really critical in advancing patient-focused drug development.
We appreciate that. Thank you very much, and very much looking forward to also getting into, exactly as you described, the way the foundation has iterated its focus, and to reaffirm what you just shared, the importance of patient science in this era, and the chance for advocates to lead the way new treatments develop is a very special part of where we are, and a very, very special part of having your voices here. If we could go next to Neil and ask you to discuss a little bit, same of your background with the HTAI Patient and Citizen Involvement Group.
Neil Bertelson. I'm here representing HTAI, and that's the International Scientific Society for Health Technology Assessment. And as Brad said, that's a sort of a step. It's not really a regulatory step, but it's a reimbursement step that's used in Europe, used in South America. It's used in Asia, so places like Japan have HTA, Canada, Brazil, as well as in Europe. So what is HTA and why is patient involvement so important? Why is it important to me? Well, when I started as a patient advocate, we had no such thing as HTA. So we just had the regulatory approval for a medicine, and then the medicine was available. And then public healthcare systems, and it should be said that HTA is really designed for public healthcare systems. Public healthcare systems started saying, yeah, but we need to start making some tough decisions now. And how do we make those tough decisions? Do we listen to those who shout loudest, or do we ensure that we have a sort of equitable process that applies to all disease areas and all kinds of patient organizations and all kinds of patients? And so they developed this process called HTA, developed in the 70s, actually in America, strangely in the USA, but it's actually used outside of the USA, to really use evidence to make those kinds of decisions about what is reimbursed in a national public healthcare system. And yet, when they did that, they missed the patient perspective. So they said, okay, let's look at the clinical evidence. Let's look at the economic evidence. And there was this massive piece of evidence missing, which was the patient evidence, how patients experience their disease, how patients experience current treatments within that healthcare system. And therefore, what is the unmet need and that value from the patient perspective? So when they first started doing HTA, there was a big question about the legitimacy of HTA. Because if you're asking all of these questions and you're making all these decisions, but you're not including patients, you're missing a massive part of the puzzle. And so what I've been doing, and others for the last decade or so, is working with health technology assessment bodies and saying, how can we put patient involvement and patient evidence within HTA processes to help improve the quality of your decision making? And I see a big link back to the regulators, so the FDA, European Medicine Agency. We're now into a place where they're all asking the same questions of patients and patient organizations. I think we're entering a massive world of opportunity, but we need to grab hold of it. We need to understand what's available and work with the right people and the right knowledge to make that change happen. Thanks, Brad.
Absolutely. It's a delight to have you here with us today, Neil, and your consistent leadership on these topics over time for, exactly as you say, bringing patient voice to the development of new treatments, which is an experience that improves everything for everyone, including patient outcomes. So thank you for being with us. If I could we go to Kate to discuss your experience and that at Myeloma Patients Europe?
Hi everyone, my name's Kate Morgan and I'm Head of Policy and Access at Myeloma Patients Europe. So we're a big network of patient advocacy organisations operating, I think it's about 31 different European countries, and we represent people who have a rare form of bone marrow cancer called myeloma. And within MPE and also across our membership, we do a lot of advocacy work on optimizing patient involvement across the life cycle of a medicine and also in decision making on medicines. And I'd really like to thank the organisers of today for sort of arranging such an interesting conversation about such an important topic for patients. And my expertise primarily sits around health technology assessment and which is used, as Neil said, by decision makers to assess the value of medicines. And I really strongly believe that you can't assess the value of a medicine without involving patients, because at the end of the day, they're the end users of the product. At MPE, I work to help our members navigate their reimbursement systems in Europe. And also we try and anticipate new drugs coming down the line. So we gather patient-based evidence. So when it gets to the regulator and HTA bodies, we have data available for them to help them with their decision-making. I previously worked at Myeloma UK, and where I had direct involvement in health technology assessment through the UK health technology assessment body. So we have 3 here. So and myeloma is a very, there's a lot of combinations and they're very expensive. So we find ourselves in front of these agencies quite frequently. And one thing about involvement in HTA and also across the life cycle of medicines is that I think it's so important is it provides the sort of human perspective on how medicines affect people in the real world. And as Neil said, I think that's missing sometimes from decision making, and it's so important. And finally, what I wanted to say was that our members who are patient advocates often say that this topic is really complex and quite difficult to understand. And I think the conversation today will be really helpful to sort of share examples and have a conversation about the importance and how we participate as patient advocates. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And agreed, what you just described, for example, about proactively gathering data about the patient experience puts advocacy in such a position to be of service to better treatments in every possible way, in effectiveness and lived experience and ultimately outcomes, fortunately. I do also have the great delight of recognizing and welcoming the moderator of today's conversation, Winslow Tucker, who is a vice president for, senior vice president, there we go, that's the word I was missing, for intercontinental work at Bristol Myers Squibb. Also, most importantly, a powerful voice for patient advocates, and particularly those from historically marginalized geographies. That's me editorializing, but I stand by that from knowing Winslow a little bit and following his social media. So the perfect person to help guide today's conversation. And I believe we will hear a little bit from Winslow to kick us off and then be able to get into the larger conversation. So Winslow, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is going to be the highlight of my day, probably the highlight of my week. As you said, I lead a region that has 84% of the world's population, over 80%, but not the access that we all want for medicines. And so that's what I do as a job. But what I'm passionate about is, as many of you, the impact that health has on people from a humanitarian perspective. And I think we have an obligation to try to help everyone reach their highest level of health. And so from that perspective, I really look forward to this conversation. Love the topic, which is around how do we design from the beginning with the end in start. So I think that's going to be really, really important. And the panelists, I know you all have very, very different and interesting perspectives. So I'm going to get us started because I think it's more hearing about you than hearing from me. And I know we have a couple of different topics that we want to talk about today. As I think about it, first, let's start with, designing, meaning early research and clinical development from that perspective. So one thing I want you each to touch on, and maybe I'll start with you, Katie, is how can patient involvement improve the quality of our clinical studies? Because clearly that's what we're talking about, is making sure we have patients involved from the beginning, but how do we see that improving the quality of our clinical studies and the data?
Yes. Well, it's hard to focus in on just one area because this is this is a point where treatments are meant to work for patients, and so there's lots of trials are hard to recruit for. So why don't you make it easier for patients? So there's lots of ways to get involved. One project that the Michael J. Fox Foundation was fortunate to be a part of, I think, is an interesting example to share. This was a patient preference study that was coordinated by medical device consortia and collaborated with the Food and Drug Administration to understand what patient preferences were for risk versus benefit. And this is an individual choice. The opportunity to have a treatment that could be transformative, but might also carry risk, is something that regulatory agencies are evaluating. And in this particular project, the team worked with patient scientists. And we had a few people say, what is a patient scientist? Somebody that lives with the disease 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, is more of an expert in the lived experience than researchers that do this as their day job. And in this particular project, the team worked to define what were areas that were most meaningful in the context of Parkinson's disease, helping define terms for the researchers in more human vocabulary versus motor fluctuations is not necessarily something that a person with Parkinson's would see on paper and say, that's me. And so in this particular project, a team that included experts at FDA, researchers at MIT, and members from the patient community worked to develop and refine cognitive interviews to understand patient perspective and develop a survey that went out to the community to help FDA understand what were the risk trade-offs that people were willing to take. And in a chronic progressive condition like Parkinson's disease, unsurprisingly, the risks that people were willing to take depended on where they were in their journey and depended on the availability of treatments versus lack of treatments for particular indications. And so this example, I think, helps clarify for regulators, okay, well, who should sponsors enroll in clinical trials? How do we evaluate minimum acceptable benefit versus risk trade-offs with the patient in mind? And I think this was also a beautiful example of patient engagement and advocacy because on the continuum, we had a group of 8 patient scientists working on the project diligently on steering committee calls, designing surveys, providing feedback, and working on the project over 2 years. And that's a small group of people that had a very large voice, but the data that actually helped FDA understand what are the risk trade-offs that the community are willing to take came from a survey that had over 8,000 people respond. And so I think for people to understand that you have a role in research, whether it's a seat at the table with scientists designing projects or completing surveys that are going to be used to quantify patient data and make it actionable, those are equally important. And the way that treatments are being designed increasingly take this patient preference information into account at all sorts of levels.
Katie, I love your example. It's not just representing what's important for patients, it's also advocating with stakeholders and ensuring that you have the data to show that that is really relevant. So thank you. That's a really, really great example. Kate, how about you? How do you see this topic?
So from my experience, I think involving patients in clinical studies makes them a lot better and can help with things like recruitment to trials and adherence, and also how we sort of inevitably gain access to that treatment in the long run. And one program that I wanted to touch upon was at MPE, we run something called a community task force, where we regularly train patients and patient advocates on how to review clinical trial protocols, and also around definitions around what is an endpoint, what is quality of life, and that type of thing. And the themes that we get back from patients as part of that program are very different to what industry would expect. And it's very intricate details that I think you can only sort of glean from having had that experience in the real world setting. For example, we get lots of feedback around treatment side effects and disease monitoring. So bone marrow biopsies in myeloma are really difficult for patients, and they always pick up on those in clinical trial protocols, and how often they're being asked things like quality of life and the burden of administration on themselves and their carers. And so I think these are very detailed things that I think refine clinical trial protocols and make them acceptable to patients. And finally, with my European access hat on, I think as we review protocols, we pick up on a lot of things around the European access environment and whether the comparators that they're using are fit for purpose, and are they using the right combination of treatments, and are they gathering the right types of data that are acceptable to our regulatory and HTA bodies? Because at the end of the day, there's no point running clinical trials if you're not going to get access for patients at the end of the day. And I think it's a big picture of patient involvement in ensuring trials are fit for purpose and that patients can get treatment.
No, thank you. I really really resonates with me. And I think the point you talked about, which is, running the clinical trials, designing the clinical trials, but ultimately in mind, how do we get it to patients? That takes us to when we start to think about the regulatory process. And then we start to think about HTA, which demonstrates the value of those. So what I'd like to do is, Neil, I'd like to come to you, because I know that in Europe, this can take different forms, HTA and so forth, and you've really made a career and led massive progress in amplifying the patient experience. But can you talk to us about how your work on the progress of patient involvement has led to inclusion, or how you think it should be included in HTA decision-making? I think that links to the discussion around patient needs, putting in clinical trials, but then ultimately the demonstration of the value of the products.
Yeah, no, definitely, Winslow. And certainly, just building on that, because I think there's a bridge here from what Kate and Katie have just said. I think what patients are able to do is highlight impacts of the disease and impacts of current treatments that haven't been considered by the HTA body, and in some circumstances, actually not by the company that's developing the medicines. There are some really good examples where patients are highlighting particular symptoms of a disease that have not been measured or considered in clinical studies. And when that happens at the very end of the process, when our HTA assessment's happening, it's telling you that things have been missed much earlier on, as Katie was saying and Kate was saying. I think that patient involvement is part of the input we want to see in research that will make health technology assessment better in the future. But when we think about HTA as a process, let me just take a step back. So in many countries, there is the regulatory process that still happens, just like the FDA in the US. And that says, basically, this is okay to market this treatment, to make it available to prescribers to prescribe. In some countries, there's a second step that says, okay, people can prescribe it, but who pays for it? If there's a public healthcare system, then there's a second question that is asked, which is, what is this new treatment giving us that we don't have already? So what's the extra piece that this new treatment gives us, the sort of added benefit, if you like, of this new treatment that's worth paying for? And there's an assessment around that. Now, very often that assessment really focuses on the clinical evidence at the time of launch. And sometimes for rare diseases, for precision medicine, that clinical evidence can be quite limited because patient populations in clinical trials are quite small. Sometimes there's a problem with these studies because they're single arm studies. They're not in the clinical trials, they're not looking at this treatment directly against another treatment. They're sort of looking at it on its own. And that's okay from a regulatory decision-making process. But it creates a problem when you're in HTA, because HTA is about comparing the new with what we have already. And so where patients come into this is they're able to direct the decision makers to key points that are most important to them. It could be symptoms that really cause them the most problems. It could be aspects of how current therapies are that really also cause challenges in their daily life. So it can say to those decision committees, you need to be looking here and here when you're assessing this medicine. And how does that happen? So there's various ways this happens. It depends on the country, and it depends on how sophisticated and how big that health technology assessment body is. So often patient organizations are invited to submit written evidence, and they provide their own evidence they've collected from patients through surveys from other data sources as part of that. Then you have patients that actually come to the committee meeting and they're there in the conversation, and they can take part, they can give testimony, they can answer questions. And alongside the patient organization, these days you often have what we call expert patients. And those are patients with the disease who are really good at explaining for them individually what it's like to live with that disease. And they can answer some quite complex questions there. And what we're trying to do with this patient involvement process is improve the quality of the decision that's made. That doesn't mean it's always a yes, by the way. I wish that was the case, but that's not always the case. But it does mean that the patient perspective is part of that decision, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
Yes, thank you, Neil. I really I love how you're connecting it, because we started and we talked about clinical trials, and there's stakeholders there. There is then the approval process from regulatory. There's stakeholders and HTA stakeholders. But ultimately, if we don't view it as one continuous process, as you described, we'll design clinical trials for regulatory, but it doesn't necessarily demonstrate the value of the products to patients. And so, thank you. This is a complex topic, but what it says to me is that we need to have collaboration across all of the stakeholders with a view of what's most important from the beginning. So thank you, because I think that's great. I'll just open up this point. Any of the panelists want to make any other comments on that before I move on a little bit?
I'd like to believe, and I think this is true, that FDA's increasing focus on patient-focused drug development and guidance around, at least in Parkinson's disease, the endpoints that are appropriate to use in clinical trials being meaningful to patients are also the ones that end up being meaningful to payers, and of course the consumer. So I do believe that it's been a challenge to have that fragmented set of milestones rather than the continuum, but I'm optimistic that people recognize those challenges, and things are the frameworks of patient-focused drug development, especially as it relates to better endpoints or measures that are used for determining efficacy in clinical trials. If those are developed as patient-centered instruments, then that becomes closer to a continuum where regulators and payers are looking at the same data to determine efficacy and value.
That's so important. I'm glad you brought that example up of like regulators looking at that. Any other comments from others on how where you see maybe some progress in regulators or other stakeholders taking into account more as we start to think about that? Because ultimately, as you said, the HTA process is a collection of data at its essence.
Winslow, I can just build on what Kate has just said, because I completely agree with that. And we see this. So when we work with regulators, you can look at the FDA's patient-focused drug development program. Look at their description for what they call patient experience data. So they're really recommending that companies and researchers are creating what they call patient experience data, which captures the expectations, the needs, the experiences of patients. They have a list of questions they want that data to answer. Exactly the same list of questions that HTA bodies ask patient groups to answer. So Katie, you're right. I see this completely coming together in the years ahead, but we need to work to make that happen.
So if we think then about HTA bodies that have this data, we talked about the need to include the patient perspective, and there's obviously some momentum for that. Just a general question. What do you see as the continued challenges to ultimately reaching our goal of ensuring that that is included? Any thoughts on what we can continue to do? Because obviously we're not where we want to be, but just your thoughts in general, continual challenges to have that patient voice included in the HTA process.
Go on, Kate.
I was just going to say, from a patient advocacy perspective, I think one of the challenges that we have is sort of knowing the types of data that HTA bodies want from patient groups and how we gather that. So what we hear from some HTA bodies and also regulators like the European Medicines Agency is that they want robust data, and some HTA bodies want qualitative data, and it's really difficult to sort of navigate that feedback and understand how we gather that in what robust means from their perspective. So I think that's a big challenge for the patient community, and I think we all want to get better at generating that types of evidence and inputting it into the process, but I think it's quite difficult for us to do. And the other challenge that I see, particularly in Europe, is that many HTA bodies don't actually involve patients in their decision making. Some do it really well, like the Scottish Medicines Consortium and NICE, and others, they might think they do it well, but patient advocates don't think that, and others just don't involve them at all. And I think there's a role for the patient advocacy community to really sort of understand their HTA bodies in the process, and to think about how we use best practice examples to advocate for better patient involvement.
One opportunity to get better too, as we're talking about the clarity of data collection that could help support patient perspectives. As advocates, as a funder at the Fox Foundation, we need to do a better job of ensuring that we collect representative data. And collecting data from patients is the first step, but if it is who participates in research traditionally is wealthy, white, well-educated individuals, and that does not represent the communities that we're serving. And so there is important investment that needs to be made to engage diverse types of individuals in research, and especially this qualitative research. So I think that the solutions to that are making it easy for communities to get engaged. And that takes work and effort, because even in this digital age, there is a digital divide. And many of the people that might be left out of traditional brick and mortar research could continue to be left out of digital enabled research. And so it is on patient advocacy groups and organizations to be better at collecting a representative voice.
Thank you. I think that's so important. And then also, I like your connection to your first example, which is like, how do you, one, advocate for the data, but then generate that data with stakeholders to give it that credibility piece to be included in the HTA process as well. So we're really talking about how do we, in practice, get the patient's voice into this. So I'll just open up to all of you, but any examples of where we've seen it successfully done? I think it's important to put out the challenges, but then show where we've had some successes to build off of and share. So have you seen where you thought it was really well done, getting that patient voice into the HTA process from a regulatory perspective?
So Winslow, I can give you an example where we've seen real change happen. So this example is from England. It was a rare disease, a lipodystrophy. And the clinical data and everything was all around these lipid measures that you have in your blood. And the patient group came along. It's a rare disease. And the patient group along said, that's got nothing to do with how we experience this disease. It's got nothing at all to do with what's a challenge for us, which is this extreme hunger that you feel when you have this condition. And this extreme hunger overtakes your life and creates lots of psychosocial challenges, social challenges, isolation challenges, all of those kinds of things. Wasn't mentioned by any of the experts, just not mentioned by any of the experts. And yet the committee really listened to that, and they made it their number one point when they said, actually, we will recommend reimbursement of this, even though it is a high cost medicine. We do understand now that we've heard of the patient, from the patient organizations and the patients, how debilitating this one symptom is. And so we have isolated examples like that. You know, the challenge we have across HTA, and Kate mentioned this, is we see processes as very patchy. So it's finding those isolated examples and saying, what made this good? How do we share the elements that made this particular interaction really good with other HTA bodies, other patient groups? And that's certainly a process that's ongoing, and I think it's gaining speed at the moment. So I think there's opportunities here, but we do have work to do still.
I think that's very well said. So now we have a number of obviously advocates here. So I want to maybe open it up and ask the panelists, what do you hope is the future of patient involvement, and how our attendees today can help to make that a reality, right? We all have that passion. What do you hope that future looks like, and maybe some advice on how you would like our attendees to join in that process?
Starting on the sort of early side of research, one thing that we struggle with is getting people to raise their hand. So we have a very large community of individuals who are engaged with the foundation, contribute to fundraising events. And I think a bigger gift is the gift of time. And so even if you think you may not have an important voice, please know that you do, and find a way to get engaged with an advocacy organization that is able to centralize and elevate your voice. I mentioned up in the chat a publication, and two of the women on that we go to for many things, and they are becoming increasing experts, but they also have lives and day jobs. And so the ability for you to recruit other advocates or to get engaged and donate and volunteer your time in different ways is an important call to action that I hope this group here today is willing to take action on.
I love that your voice matters, and that amplification really is required in a lot of ways. I love that. Any other thoughts, or we'll just continue, and we can also get some questions hopefully from our participants as well.
One thing that I wanted to mention was that I think in advocacy, there can be a tendency, and I know I used to do this, just to sort of wait to be asked by industry and other stakeholders to comment on a clinical trial or to input into the clinical development process. And also in HTA as well, I think sometimes we need to be a bit more proactive as advocates and think about how we get industry to listen to us. And I think in the European advocacy community, we have community advisory boards where we actually invite industry to our advisory boards and ask them to tell us about their clinical development programs. And also the task force model that I mentioned, where we engage with them to provide their clinical trial protocols to us to review. And I think there are sort of good examples across the community that we can share and utilize, because I think that starts to get people listening. And when we do have provide good feedback for industry, they start to see the value of patient evidence, and it sort of grows from there.
And what I'll add to that, Winslow, sorry, Winslow.
No, go ahead, please, Neil.
What I would add to that is that sometimes I think we forget the policymakers in all of this as well, because the policymakers set the remit for the regulators, for the FDA, European Medicines Agency. It's your national policymakers that determine the focus of health technology assessment, HTA. They determine the size of the healthcare budget, the priorities of the healthcare. So sometimes I think building on Kate's point about being proactive, it's also not just focusing all your attention on just the regulatory body or the HTA body that you might have in your country, but thinking, why are they making those decisions? Why do they have those particular restrictions in place? And it's working with policymakers to change that. It's a bit of a longer term process, but I think it's really important that we engage with policymakers where we see that processes are not working.
Neil, I really, really love your point, because we've talked about the challenges, but it's really an integrated system. And how do we get that integrated system to work better? Which, to your point, and maybe I'll just amplify what was said, which is, make your voice heard and amplified, but across the system of stakeholders, because each has a role to play, from that development right through regulatory and then HTA. So really, really well said. Thank you. Spot on, spot on, as was said in the chat as well. So what I want to do is I want to open up and make sure that our attendees, please feel free to ask any questions or provide any input from your side as well.
Thank you. We do have a few questions, if I might share them. And starting with Kate, if you wouldn't mind, could we revisit, please, your experience with what the patient voice in regulation can do in practice? How have you successfully seen this done? You alluded to that a few minutes ago.
So we've got quite a few examples in the myeloma community of where sort of we've engaged with the UK sort of regulatory and health technology assessment bodies on sort of the availability of myeloma drugs. And I think the Scottish Medicines Consortium, which is the HTA body in Scotland, they have, because health technology assessment can be quite an intimidating process for patients and patient advocates to participate in, they actually have a process for rare and end-of-life diseases where they sort of take the patient out of the full committee meeting and sit them down and ask them direct questions, and they have the doctors in the room as well, and it really offers the opportunity to explore the pros and cons of a medicine and how it should be used in practice. And for a specific sort of myeloma drug in the relapsed and refractory setting, we were able to gather patient data through qualitative interviews and present that to the committee and really explore sort of what the opportunities of the drug were for patients. So it prolonged survival, and they told us that meant that they can conduct normal daily activities, which is quite a subjective thing, but we always hear that from patients. And we were able to steer the committee to a discussion around the side effects of the medicine. So peripheral neuropathy was something that patients really told us was something that they found difficult to live with, and this medicine reduced the burden of this. And so that was something that the committee felt that was so important that it was reflected in the final guidance. And also with this specific drug, patients had to receive it for, I think it was 52 hospital visits every year. And the committee sort of raised to us that was very burdensome to patients. And we were able to say, well, for some patients that is quite burdensome if you have kids, if you rely on a carer, but for other patients, they might see the survival benefit of the drug and be willing to attend hospital that frequently. And so I think the drug in question was eventually approved, and in the guidance you can see all of the feedback that we contributed to the submission was taken into account, and it's referenced, and the committee, you could see, were really listening to us. And I think that was a really good example of where we felt listened to and how we sort of sought reimbursement and collaborated with a committee to get access to it. So I think there are good examples, as Neil said, in different HTA bodies, but I think sometimes this isn't sort of communicated across advocacy.
Agreed. And what a powerful story to show that the decision makers were listening to the nuance and to just recognize there are different lived experiences within the same community, of course. And so that's a really powerful way to amplify and understand those complexities. Wow. Another question, if I may, because the four of you are each doing outstanding work on amplifying voices, and we have 80 advocates with us here today who are on similar journeys within this space to improve patient outcomes and experiences. So one of the questions that we have is, what was your first step in advocacy? Which can be any of the four of you, but I think the subtext of this is people seeking to understand how to grow in their own journeys as advocates. What was your first step? How did you come to do this?
Brad, I can give you my experience. A HIV advocate in the time before we had good treatments for HIV. I received my diagnosis over a bank holiday weekend, so I couldn't see anybody to get advice. I received it by letter, which was quite unusual in those days. So I just got a letter, through the post. And I remember sitting on my bed, just thinking, oh my God, what do I do now? I'd got a job I didn't like really. And, it just like, so, and I was looking through this newspaper, and then I saw this advert for looking for an editor for a new national magazine for people with HIV on the very same day. But I was sat on my bed thinking, oh my God, what do I do? And I just applied. And that was it was a gut reaction. It was a knee-jerk reaction. This was a long time before the internet, by the way. It shows you how old I am. But that was my step into that world. And so that was the first step I made. And then over doing that, by doing that job, you start to realize that you have a voice for other people as well as yourself. You may have initially wanted to do this to help yourself or to understand yourself, but you become a voice for others. And that becomes very empowering to yourself and very rewarding as you see the effect that's happening. So it becomes like a snowball.
Maybe I could add from a different perspective, which is having worked with a number of different advocates. And I think, what you described is you've got to have a passion and put yourself out there, as some of our panels said. I would also say connect with others that are doing similar work. Learn from each other, I think, is so critically important. I learned when I connect with what can we do? What can I take back to my company? How can I make sure that the process works better? What do I see happening in certain, advocacy groups that I can share with others? And I think, share and steal shamelessly, because we all want the same thing. So that's just one thing I would leave with everyone.
And we adore that, of course. It's the spirit of this very thing. It's why we're here together. At a minimum, is to steal like artists, if we want to borrow some language. Kate or Katie, would you like to share a little bit about the beginning of your advocacy experience?
Yeah, so I sort of fell into advocacy. So my first job out of uni was working at Myeloma UK, which at the time was led by a really passionate man called Eric Lowe, who when I joined, they'd just sort of come out of the end of campaigning for a drug called Velcade, which was the first novel agent for myeloma that had ever, before Velcade came along, patients would have a transplant or sort of very basic chemotherapy, and the survival rates were quite poor. And then Velcade came along, and everyone knew it was really, really good, but no one could get access to it. And I think the trial data wasn't good enough for the UK HTA bodies to approve it, even though they sort of knew that it worked. And so when I joined Myeloma UK in the aftermath of this, and just the passion and the amount of work that had gone into it, and there were new drugs coming down the line, and I just got more and more involved in the access to medicines, and I just saw the benefit of advocacy, because without it, patients wouldn't have got access to those drugs. And I think it really helps improve outcomes in patients' lives generally.
I'd say for me, it's an intersection of different experiences. In a previous life long ago, I was a clinical trial coordinator, and went to graduate school to get a PhD, and had never held a micropipette because I never needed to know that. And I had been a psychology major undergrad, and decided to do a PhD in neuroscience. And I studied cultures being different rather than brains in an animal. So I think for me, the opportunity to have gone through experience of seeing what patient experience is like in a clinical trial, understanding also the ecosystem of what a hospital setup looks like, and how that experience translates for people who are participating in research as part of care. Fast forward to being at the Fox Foundation, you see protocols come in and you think, I don't understand how you could be asking patients to do this, or how you could be asking even coordinators to do this. This isn't going to work practically. And so I think bringing human experience, and oftentimes I think, you're better off being a bartender and designing recruitment materials, because you would talk to people in a way that is accessible and human rather than a PhD or an MD. That this is a place where I get excited because you just show up as yourself and help people understand what resonates with people and what's important to them. And this is something that I like to bring forward within our work, looking at protocols that we receive, providing feedback on, okay, how long are you asking people to participate in this study? Oh, forever. Forever. Would you do that forever? And I think it's important for advocates to realize that these are perspectives that many people in their deep expertise may forget about the humanness of what it means to live with a disease, what it means to participate in research, and what people's expectations are from their care. And so I would encourage people to just help remind those experts, quote unquote, what patients are looking for.
Love that. What a beautiful concluding statement, this showing up as yourself. I'd like to thank all of you for just being brilliant and sharing your journeys today. Winslow, thank you immensely for hosting, as well as the work you do daily on behalf of the global majority as an incredibly powerful and influential advocate. To our three panelists, naturally, thank you all for what you do every day and sharing these journeys so that we can borrow from them, so that we can learn and mirror and share resources as part of the advocacy exchange. So we are very fortunate to be here with you and with all of our attendees who have been sharing in the chat and appreciating the things that you are offering the group. If you're interested in viewing prior sessions of the Advocacy Exchange, you can do that at the advocacyexchange.com. I'll also invite everybody for our upcoming session on the 2nd of June, which is about capacity building with living proof advocacy. And otherwise, applause for all of our speakers today, as well as all of you for the things that you make happen in the world and the improvements that you make on behalf of others. But otherwise, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you on the 2nd of June. And we appreciate everything that you do every day. Thank you once again. And we look forward to supporting your advocacy journeys.